I don't know about your family, but my family, when I was younger, there were definitely a couple Christmases at least when my family made and ate figgy pudding on Christmas Eve before we opened up Christmas presents. So as a kid, I have these very distinct memories of that moment, waiting for dessert to be done so I could dig into my presents. So here I'm starting off with a honey orange juice sugar syrup that I've got on the stove here. I'm going to heat this up, and while that is warming up, I am going to cut up a bunch of dried fruits. Figgy pudding traditionally is like a cake-like dessert that is just absolutely chock full of dried fruits and nuts, and often has some rum in it and sometimes has a kind of white icing-y glaze. So because it's a pretty broad category, I kind of went rogue with my fruit choices. I think fig is pretty common, so I do have some dried figs here, and I'm just chopping all of these up into tiny little pieces. Nobody's going to see them, so they do not have to be perfect. This is going to be going inside the macaron, and it's going to be hidden by a ring of buttercream, so don't even really worry about them being perfect. Do not waste your time on that. If you even wanted to like blitz these in a food processor or something, that would probably be fine too, and would probably be a lot faster. Next up, I'm moving on to some dried apricots here. I don't think that that's very traditional, but I really like dried apricots, so I really wanted to add that in. And then I also have a couple other fruits here. I've got some dried cherries that are just a little bit too big, even though they're already quite small. So I'm just going to cut these into a couple pieces, not really crazy small. And then I also have some candied orange peel. You could make your own or buy it in the store. Then once that liquid that we put on the stove previously is starting to simmer, I'm going to dump all the dried fruits in there along with a cinnamon stick. Just really get some warming spices going here. And then I'm going to just boil this until the fruit has absorbed all of the liquid and or the liquid has caramelized and or evaporated. Basically, I want to get rid of the liquid. I'm not creating a jam here, so I'm not trying to like mash down the fruit. I want this to be super chunky, but I also want the fruit to be slightly rehydrated and a little bit caramely. So once you've got that, I'm leaving the cinnamon stick in there, and I'm just gonna pull that out, let that cool completely in my refrigerator. Now I'm moving on to the royal icing design on my macaron shells, and as I mentioned, it's kind of common for figgy pudding to have like a white glaze icing thing, and then usually there is holly because it is a Christmas dessert. So what I wanted to do was create some little royal icing holly. So I'm starting off with a pretty thick royal icing. I'm using some powdered gel food colorants. I'm using the Sugar Art Master Elites here to make a green and then a red food coloring, and then I'm just putting them into piping bags without tips, just regular piping bags, and I'm just going to snip off the very end with a scissors. I decided to go for a royal icing transfer. Why? I don't really know. You absolutely could dip the macarons first, then once that dries a little bit, or even probably like right away, you could pipe directly onto the shells the holly design, but depending on your working schedule and like when things are happening in your kitchen, you might want to do a royal icing transfer as well, which is what I'm doing here. So once you have your red and green to the colors and shade that you want, then I'm just using some parchment paper that I've stuck down onto the back of a sheet pan, and I'm totally free forming here. I'm not using like a template or a stencil or anything, just tiny little holly kind of leaves, so just creating some little pointy leaf things. And then I'm gonna go through with the red to create the like holly berries. So for each little design I have 2 leaves that are kind of next to each other, and then I'm going to pipe 3 red berries that are connecting the leaves that are at the bottom there. So for me, as I'm piping these leaves, they're not touching, but they will be, each pair is going to be part of the same little design. So yep, this took about 1 billion years, and I don't know that there's any way to really speed this up. So here's me piping a couple of pairs of holly leaves. These, especially if you just really give them time to completely dry and harden, even though they have those little points on there, these are not very fragile or breakable. So they are really easy to pluck off later, and with the little holly berries that help connect them, they will all really smoothly transfer off in one piece. If you want to make sure that the holly berries are super distinct, you can give it more time between piping each of these little berries. At first here I was just piping them all 3 in a row, and then I realized I was being a bit of an idiot, so I piped just 1, moved on to the next shape, piped 1, piped 1, piped 1, and then I went back to pipe the second one, did that everywhere, then I piped the third one and did that everywhere, and that definitely gave me more distinct little holly berries. As you can see, there are a couple where I just piped 1 little berry, and I thought that was pretty cute too. No matter what you end up with, give it time to harden completely, and then like I said, you can just pluck them right off your parchment paper, and then you have these amazing cutie little royal icing transfers to put on whatever you want. So now I have some regular white royal icing here that I do have a little bit of vanilla paste in, if you see those tiny little black flecks in there. And this is partially because I just love vanilla paste, and partially because this is trying to mimic an actual dessert. And if I were eating figgy pudding, I would want there to be just a ton of good quality vanilla in that icing. So to create a royal icing covered macaron shell, I'm just dipping straight down, kind of twisting it a little bit, shaking off a little bit of excess, turning it over, giving it another little shake to smooth out the top of the shell. And then while that layer is still moist and damp, then we're going to want to add on that transfer that we made. And this is why I'm saying, depending on your baking schedule, depending on time management for you, you may want to do the putsy royal icing transfers a couple days ahead of time, or you may want to do all of the royal icing bits right now. So that is really up to you and your schedule. I think it would work totally fine to not do the transfer and to just do everything right here, though you may want to let the white part dry a bit before piping on the holly, if that's the vibe you want, to make sure they're really distinct layers. Again, if you are using royal icing transfers, make sure to set it on quite soon after you have dipped the macaron shell in the royal icing. If you wait too long, you may have to use a bit of extra royal icing to stick the transfer onto your macaron shell, which is not the end of the world, but it is just yet one more step that you don't really need to do. I'm just going to finish dipping and adding the transfer to every single one of these shells, and then I'm going to let these dry completely before I fill them. I would say at least a couple hours, or ideally I would let these sit overnight just to make sure that they are not still moist and so they don't get weird once you fill the max and put them into your refrigerator. Once you are ready to go, it's going to be time to make the last component, the figgy pudding buttercream. I can't wait for you to make this buttercream. It is so delicious. I'm using the Swiss method here because I wanted to add in some brown sugar and molasses, which is hugely important for this flavor. Obviously, I've got my butter and egg whites, I've got vanilla. I'm using a bit of rum extract. You can feel free to use actual rum or leave that out depending on your taste. I also have some cinnamon, ginger, and cloves. And then I also have some cake mix because figgy pudding is a cake. That is really important for me to keep that element in there. Again, depending on your personal taste, you don't have to do that if you don't want to. For the Swiss method, I'm getting the egg whites, sugars, molasses, spices, extracts, all of that in a large bowl that's going to go on the top of a pan of simmering water. And I'm just going to give that a really good whisk here. As you can see, it's pretty gloopy. It looks relatively disgusting. Through this heating process here and with this double boiler, this mixture is going to thin out considerably. So when I lift the whisk up, it's going to look a lot more like water. It's going to look a lot smoother. And I'm just going to keep this on my double boiler, whisking occasionally until it reaches about 50 degrees Celsius. The main point here is to make sure that the sugar and the brown sugar have dissolved and that the egg white is no longer super clumpy like that. Once it gets a little bit warmer, it's going to get a little bit runnier even without whipping it in your mixer. So you don't have to go exactly by temperature, but you do want to really go by texture. So if you are not feeling like using a thermometer or you don't have a thermometer, just make sure to wash your hands first, then stick a finger into this bowl and you can feel, are there granules of sugar in there or should I keep it on the heat? The mixture should be hot to the touch, but not scalding. So if it is feeling too cold or too grainy, it's not done yet. And if it's feeling hot, please take it off the heat as soon as possible. I am transferring this mixture into the bowl of my stand mixer, though if you are using a hand mixer, feel free to continue working just in that same bowl. Then I am going to whip this on kind of a medium-high speed to create a nice fluffy meringue. This is going to increase in volume while it is cooling off. After it's looking light and fluffy and when it's reached just about room temperature, just above, that's when I'm going to start adding in the butter. For the butter, you've probably heard me say this a million times if you've watched my other videos. Make sure that that's at room temperature. If you forgot, it's okay. Cube it up a little bit, stick it in your microwave for like 5 seconds at a time. Do not melt it. Please, please, please do not melt your butter. But it's really important that your butter is soft enough and it is not cold, it is not rock solid, because as we incorporate the butter in here soon to this meringue mixture, you want it to incorporate quickly and smoothly. If you have cold butter, it's going to take a lot longer to mix in and it's going to shock the temperature of the meringue. So it's just going to be really, really difficult. It's going to take longer. You might have to take something warm like a blowtorch or a warm towel to the sides of your bowl to get it back to a temperature that makes it easier to whip again. It might look broken for a lot longer. So room temperature butter just prevents you from having a lot of other problems. You can see here that the meringue has lightened a lot in color. It's starting to get a lot fluffier. So this is a sign that soon it will be time to start adding in bits of butter. Because I added in all of the spices and the extracts at the beginning with my egg whites and the sugars and molasses, I only really have the butter and then the cake mix to add in after this. If you wanted to, you could keep the spices and the extracts out and add them in at the end, but they really don't harm anything, and I think heating them up with the sugar and egg whites really allows the flavor to enhance all that much more. So for me, that's something that I really like to add in at the beginning, but because we need to create that meringue structure, the butter obviously needs to be held out until later. And the cake mix, that's just something that could interfere a little bit more with the creation of a really nice meringue. So that's why I'm waiting till the end to add that in. If you've never added cake mix into a buttercream or something like that before, make sure that you've heat treated this in advance because it does contain flour. So just dump out any store-bought cake mix onto a sheet pan and just bake it for about 5 to 10 minutes at like 300 degrees Fahrenheit, just to make sure that if there are by any chance any bits of bacteria or anything like that in there, we've cooked that out. So whenever I'm adding in cake mix, yes, it is previously heat treated. As soon as all the butter is incorporated, I'll add in that bit of cake mix and then continue whipping. I'll switch to the paddle attachment just to make sure my buttercream is super smooth. Then it's going to be time to fill. Alright, so I've got my macaron shells with their royal icing decor that is completely dry and hardened. I've got my figgy pudding inspired buttercream, and then I've got my figgy pudding inspired fruit compote sort of situation, and I'm just using a piping tip on here to make sure that the buttercream just looks as silky and smooth and perfect as possible, though you absolutely do not have to do this. While there are a lot of recipes when I say you can either pipe a ring like this or pipe one bulb if you have something you want to shove onto the inside, with this method I think it's way easier to pipe a ring and then place the dried fruit compote situation on the inside, just to really make sure you have the space for it. If you pipe one bulb of buttercream, you can still shove the dried fruit mixture onto the inside, but it's going to be a lot more challenging and it's going to get quite messy. So I am just using a tiny spoon here to blob a little bit of the dried fruit into the center. Depending on how small you cut up your dried fruit and what the end consistency is, you might be able to use a piping bag to squish it in there, but whatever it works best for you is totally fine. As soon as I've got all of these macarons filled, I am going to sandwich them just like normal and then get them into my refrigerator to mature completely. These macarons, I know they have a lot of different elements between the buttercream, they have that fruit inside, and then the royal icing dip. Don't worry, they mature just like normal. I find that sometimes buttercream filled macarons mature a bit more slowly than a ganache filled macaron. I think that the fruit does add an extra bit of moisture, so I don't feel like these ones were super slow to mature. And because the fruit doesn't have a ton of moisture in it, it's not a jam or anything like that, it didn't mature too quickly. So I think these are a really, really great macaron, really easy and fun to work with, even though there are a lot of different elements. I really hope you loved this recipe, and I really hope you give it a try. Honestly, they were really fun to make and even better to eat, and just the perfect kind of nostalgic flavor for me. If you do give this recipe a try or are inspired to create anything based off of this, make sure to tag me on Instagram so I can see your end results. If you're not already following me there, you can find me at Maddie Brame, and make sure to tap that subscribe button down below so you can see all of my next tutorials and recipes here. Until next time, have a wonderful day. Bye!